Hello and welcome to this Anatomy Physiology Bio 202 video lecture on the respiratory system. I'm Mr. Kennedy and I'll be your guide as we explore this topic together. To begin, we'll examine the difference between breathing and respiration. Respiration is the exchange of gases between the atmosphere, blood, and cells. The combination of three processes is required for respiration to occur: ventilation, or the act of breathing, followed by external and internal respiration. External respiration is often referred to as pulmonary respiration, while internal respiration is often referred to as tissue respiration. The cardiovascular system assists the respiratory system by transporting gases. Structurally, the components of the respiratory system are divided into two parts, the upper and lower respiratory system. Functionally, the components of the respiratory system are again divided into two, this time two zones, the conducting zone and respiratory zone. This is a general depiction of the organs and structures of the respiratory system. Make sure to note the name and position of each item in these diagrams. The upper respiratory system consists of the nose, pharynx, and associated structures, while the lower respiratory system consists of the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Next, we'll examine the nose, pharynx, larynx, and trachea. Be sure to note the position and name of each item in this labeled diagram. The external portion of the nose is made of cartilage and skin, and it is lined with mucous membranes, as seen here. The bony framework of the nose is formed by the frontal, nasal, and maxillary bones, illustrated in the picture below. The nasal concha and medius are illustrated in this diagram. Finally, the surface anatomy of the nose, which consists of the root, apex, bridge, and external nares, labeled in the picture to the right. Moving on from the nose, the pharynx. The pharynx functions as a passageway for air and food. It provides a resonating chamber for speech sounds and houses the tonsils, which participate in immunological reactions against foreign invaders. The pharynx is subdivided into three sections depicted below: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The larynx is your voice box, and it is a passageway that connects the pharynx and trachea. Again, be sure to note the name and position of each labeled item in this diagram. The larynx also contains your vocal cords, which produce sounds that your mouth, lips, and tongue form into the spoken word. This is a depiction of your vocal cords. Next is the trachea. The trachea extends from the larynx to the primary bronchi. As seen in this picture, the trachea is a large, round, open tube held open by tracheal cartilage that goes almost all the way around the entire trachea. One portion of the trachea is not lined with cartilage, and that is the portion that abuts against the esophagus, as seen in the picture below. Bronchi. At the superior border of the fifth thoracic vertebra, the trachea branches into a right primary bronchus, which enters the right lung, and a left primary bronchus, which enters the left lung. Again, note the name and position of each labeled structure in this diagram. Upon entering the lungs, the primary bronchi further divide to form smaller and smaller diameter branches. The terminal bronchioles are the end of the conducting zone. On the right, we have the branching of the bronchial tree, starting with the trachea, then main bronchi, lobar bronchi, segmental bronchi, bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. The lungs are paired organs in the thoracic cavity. The lungs are enclosed and protected by the pleural membrane. The lobes and fissures of the lungs are illustrated here. Be sure to note the name and position of each labeled structure on this slide. Alveoli. When the conducting zone ends at the terminal bronchioles, the respiratory zone begins. The respiratory zone terminates at the alveoli, the air sacs found within the lungs. Alveoli are sac-like structures illustrated in this diagram, a single cell layer in thickness. There are two kinds of alveolar cells, type 1 and type 2, that you can see illustrated in this diagram. Again, be sure to note the name and relative position of each labeled structure in these pictures. The respiratory membrane is composed of a layer of type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells and associated alveolar macrophage that constitutes the alveolar wall. An epithelial basement membrane underlying the alveolar wall, a capillary basement membrane that is often fused to the epithelial basement membrane, and the capillary endothelium. Blood enters the lungs via the pulmonary arteries through what we refer to as pulmonary circulation, and the bronchial arteries through systemic circulation. Blood exits the lungs via the pulmonary veins and the bronchial veins. Ventilation-perfusion coupling occurs, where vasoconstriction in response to hypoxia diverts blood from poorly ventilated areas to well-ventilated areas. This table will provide a summary of the structures of the respiratory system by name, tissue, and eventually special features. Pulmonary ventilation. In pulmonary ventilation, air flows between the atmosphere and the alveoli of the lungs because of alternating pressure differences created by contraction and relaxation of respiratory muscles. We know that alternating contraction and relaxation of respiratory muscles as inhalation and exhalation. Inhaling and exhaling, creating pressure changes, is analogous to Boyle's law. Boyle's law describes pressure changes that drive inhalation and exhalation. The volume of gas varies inversely with its pressure. The muscles of inhalation and exhalation are illustrated here. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles are of utmost importance in allowing us to both draw a breath and to exhale. As illustrated here, the movement of the diaphragm changes significantly during inhalation and exhalation. Pressure changes in pulmonary ventilation are illustrated in this graphic. Note the pressure change as we inhale and as we exhale. Other factors affecting pulmonary ventilation include surface tension, elastic recoil, and compliance. Surface tension involves an inwardly directed force in the alveoli, which must be overcome to expand the lungs during each inspiration. Elastic recoil references the decrease in the size of the alveoli during expiration, and compliance is the ease with which the lungs and thoracic wall can be expanded. This graphic illustrates our lung volumes and capacity. It's important to note each with their respective volumes before moving on. It is also important to note the differences in males and females and the different lung capacities. The exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide is governed by Dalton's law and Henry's law. In Dalton's law, each gas in a mixture exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. And in Henry's law, the quantity of a gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility coefficient when the temperature remains constant. During external respiration, oxygen will dissolve from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries, while carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. During internal respiration, oxygen will diffuse from the systemic capillaries into the tissue, while again carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. This graphic illustrates the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen in different locations and the subsequent diffusion of each gas. The transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. 1.5% of the oxygen that is transported in our blood is dissolved in plasma, while 98.5% is carried by hemoglobin. 7% of the carbon dioxide that's transported in our blood is dissolved in the plasma, while 23% of the carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin inside red blood cells as carbamine hemoglobin. 70% of the CO2 is transported as bicarbonate ions, or HCO3. There are several factors that can affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. The pressure of oxygen, pH, temperature, type of hemoglobin, all are things that can affect the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin. Here are a couple of graphics illustrating those ideas. As you look closely at this particular diagram, you can see a variance in the affinity oxygen has for hemoglobin by changing your pH. This illustrates a difference in affinity for hemoglobin based on temperature. And this graphic illustrates the on and off loading of oxygen and carbon dioxide in internal and external respiration. The control of respiration, or simply put, why do we breathe? This graphic illustrates the very reason why we breathe. Note active and inactive respiratory groups during forceful breathing and during quiet breathing. Control of respiration can be influenced by cortical influences, which allow conscious control of respiration that may be needed to avoid inhaling noxious gases or water. Chemoreceptors can also control respiration. Central and peripheral chemoreceptors monitor levels of oxygen and CO2 and provide input to the respiratory center. The respiratory center is embedded in the medulla oblongata, as illustrated here. Hypercapnia is a slight increase in the partial pressure of CO2 and thus hydrogen ions, and that will stimulate chemoreceptors. Hypoxia is oxygen deficiency at the tissue level. It may be caused by low partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood due to high altitude, airway obstruction, or fluid in the lungs. The control of respiration is governed by a feedback loop, as illustrated here. And this concludes our coverage of the respiratory system.